No one can deny that we're going into a time of economic uncertainty. In fact, I think we can all agree we're already in a time of economic uncertainty. The back and forth with tariffs means that our goods that come from overseas are increasing in price. Meanwhile, wages are stagnant and jobs are being cut to make up for the rising cost of doing business, of buying the components to build things or to run businesses. And of course, we're seeing the instability in our government. There is becoming less and less trust for our government to have rule of law. And if they have rule of law, that they're doing so in an ethical, transparent, non-corrupt manner. All of these things mean that the economic outlook is very uncertain, and many historians and economists predict we're heading for a second Great Depression. Now, I'm not the first prepper to talk about a second Great Depression. I am not the 20th prepper to talk about a second Great Depression. We are heading towards at least an economic downturn and major recession, but probably more than that. And in another video, I'm going to talk about what it means to live through the collapse of the American empire, because that's what's happening. We're watching the end of American imperialism. And in 10 years, we're not going to be a superpower, or at least certainly not the only superpower. And so what does it mean to be living in the transition of that? In this video, I want to talk about some of the big picture things we can learn from the Great Depression and how that can begin to help us as we plan for this economic recession, this major change in our economics that is in a lot of ways unprecedented in our lifetimes. By the way, if you're new, hi, my name is Becky and this is Sustainable Prepping, where I empower through preparedness. My goal is to encourage everyday people, not people who are doomers, but everyday people to be prepared for emergencies. And I do it from a politically progressive standpoint, which is an anomaly here in the emergency preparedness space. You don't have to agree with me on anything to get something of value from these videos, but please know that I am encouraging every single person, no matter your age, your income, your political beliefs. If you are watching this, you have some interest in emergency preparedness, and I hope you take this as a sign to go get something done. I don't ask this very often, but I would love it if you liked this video and subscribe to the channel, because it helps me get out there in the algorithm to reach other everyday people with a message of calm and confident preparedness, which is what I'm all about. So when I was thinking about the Great Depression and reading some articles on the Great Depression and how people survived it, one of the things that I took away was there was a conflation of events, right? The Great Depression wasn't just the stock market crash of 1929, although that was a huge part of it, but it overlapped with the Dust Bowl, which meant we had weather patterns that meant our capacity to grow our own food was squeezed, on top of the fact that stocks tanked because of protectionist tariffs, among other things. So lots of jobs were cut because there wasn't any money because the stock market crashed. People lost tons of money. And in addition, farmers were being squeezed because several years of really bad weather, not having enough rain, not having enough crops, meant that we didn't have the backup bumper crop that we had had in years past, and we weren't able to grow enough food to distribute in a way that was useful. Now, there's a lot more things going on there, right? We could get into the weeds. We had this conflation of problems, right? It wasn't just a stock market crash. It was also weather problems that meant our crop production was depressed, right? It was depressed. There was also corruption. There was also robber barons who knew they would be able to buy up land and property, which is what's going to happen here, right? Be prepared for major corporations to be buying up houses and farm property that is foreclosed upon because farmers or homeowners who lose their jobs can't hold on to them. So these are things we need to be kind of prepared for. If you can pay off any property loans you have out, or pay them down, or get to a place where you can get that monthly payment down should you lose a job or lose hours at your job, that would be something I would recommend. That being said, we can look at what families did to try to survive. And I want to give you some more ideas, some more really practical tips on things that we can learn from the Great Depression. The first one is just the rising cost of everything, right? Inflation went sky high while wages went low and people lost their jobs. So not only did things cost more because there was less availability, we also had less income to buy, right? Your purchasing power was even more limited. So if you want to address this coming problem, my recommendation is to really start storing staples. Now, this is Prepper 101 knowledge, right? Store your rice, your beans, your flour, your oats, your sugar and salt, those basics. but also store other things you eat. Focus on what you already use so that you have a pantry that is stocked with things you already use. This in the short term will mean that your dollar is stretching as far as it can in the meantime, but in the long term, if you have less buying power, you can start using things from your pantry to bulk up your slimmer and slimmer grocery basket. I would say store your staples, store rice, store beans, store oats, those sorts of things. Store freeze-dried items that you use. I'm a huge fan of individual ingredient freeze-dried items. I particularly have quite a few things like freeze-dried meats because they store so well, and if a freeze-dried can falls off the shelf, it's not going to shatter like a home canned jar of meat. So there's a benefit there if you can afford to make that initial investment. I also like freeze-dried cheese because cheese is a little bit more challenging to store. You have to kind of freeze it, so it just saves on freezer space. So those would be the kinds of things that I would invest in. I would do proteins and things like cheese, things like butter powder, stuff that is going to skyrocket in price likely, that you can invest in, and then it will last a really long time. I'm not as keen on focusing on things like fruits and veggies because later on, you're going to hear me say, grow a garden. You can grow microgreens. You can grow a small plot of just, spinach and kale and herbs to give you some variety. Growing victory gardens is something that can happen. And if enough people get involved, you don't have to be a master. So I'm not worried about having a ton of those things in my storage if my money is tight. I would really recommend you get those staples that can, again, help set you up for when your buying power decreases. So I just want to say, really thinking about the staples, the long-term essential staples, particularly the things that are going to go up in price, like your proteins, that you can buy a lot of and store effectively and efficiently, will be a huge, huge win for you. They will serve you in any crisis, right? Depression or not, they will be a huge, huge benefit. But they will then give you a working pantry that you can then use to pad your groceries every week when that dollar doesn't go as far, right? When that dollar doesn't go, or there's not as much on the shelves, which is probably what's going to happen. We're going to have this conflation of the dollar being less powerful and less availability, and that's going to be our perfect storm. Buy your staples, and not just grains and beans, but also invest, if you have the money, in really high quality freeze-dried proteins. And I would say get some cheese for your soul. If you're a dairy eater, get some of those things for your soul just to give you the variety. Okay, that's a long-winded sort of first point, but I think it's the most important. The second one is a garden. I know that this is standard prepper recommendations, but I do want to say you don't have to be self-sufficient. Your goal with a victory garden is not to grow all your calories. In fact, I actually think that that's a waste of your energy. I think you should be looking at your most calorie dense and your most nutrition dense and figuring out what those are and what you can grow that are hardy and hard to kill, okay? Don't try to grow bell peppers. Bell peppers are lovely and I love them and they're one of my favorite vegetables. But as far as calorie dense and nutrition dense, they have a fair amount of nutrition, but you don't need them. There are other options to get all the nutrients you can get in a bell pepper, and bell peppers are finicky. Right? Bell peppers are prissy plants. So don't worry about them. If you live in an area where tomatoes don't grow super well, don't stress about growing tomatoes. Grow other things. Figure out what greens grow well in your area and that you like. Do you like kale? If you hate kale, don't bother growing kale. Grow other things. Grow spinach. Grow mustard greens. Find something that you like. Do you like cucumbers, or do you like particular varieties of cucumbers? Do they grow in your area? Grow those. Do you like, what herbs and spices can you add so you have variety to add to your cooking, right? Do you like potatoes? Can you grow potatoes, right? You might have a year's worth of potato dices and powders and whatever, but there's nothing like a good baked potato. So can you grow potatoes? Can you grow sweet potatoes, which have a whole different nutrition profile? They're actually a totally different species of plant. Can you grow sweet potatoes? If you're in the deep south, you can. So can you start learning how to do that and begin to add to by learning how to do that? You don't have to do everything, right? Don't worry about fruit trees right now, unless you want to, unless you're personally interested in creating a more sort of homesteady, food forest, permaculture lifestyle, something where you're planning on doing a lot of gardening. If your goal is more, I want to have a victory garden for calorie purposes, not for, I like this as a hobby and I want this to be a lifestyle, Fruit takes a long time to mature. Nuts take a long time to mature. Trees of any kind take a long time to mature. Focus on things like, radishes grow super fast. Microgreens grow super fast. Spinach and lettuces can sometimes grow super fast depending upon their variety. And those are going to give you a lot of vegetables. Conifers, depending upon your environment, can be really, really good options, but they can be challenging too. You got to learn how to manage the bugs and such. What are you going to do? Are you going to try to go organic? Do you want to have a backup of pesticides? How are you going to plan that? How are you going to manage the pests in your area, the squirrels and the deer and the other wildlife? Go ahead and start something. Squash tends to be pretty good as long as it's not too damp of an environment. Go figure out what you can grow that's going to give you the most calories and nutrition bang for your buck. Again, don't buy the top 5 most commercial things, okay? Don't worry about those. Don't worry about planting corn and wheat, right? Go stock up on those in your staples. Go make that plan now. Stock up on those things in your staples. Save your victory garden for giving yourself nutritional variety and calorie density to pad in those calories, right? With things like potatoes, things like squash, things like pumpkins, stuff like that, okay? And then of course greens, a ton of greens, because that will give you some good nutrition. My third recommendation is to start now with practicing good food stewardship. So during the Great Depression, nothing got wasted because food was so precious, because clothing was so precious, because everything was so precious. Every bit of fuel, every bit of food, every bit of clothing, every single item was super precious. People learned to be really good stewards. In fact, most people already were, and they just took it to 11. We, as 21st century Americans, have terrible stewardship of our resources. I would argue that even poor folks, even the poorest among us, are wealthy in the sense that we have a lot of waste. We are used to wasting a lot. And it's a hard mindset. I struggle with the amount of waste because on the one hand, I want to be super sustainable in that I have very little waste, right? And on the other hand, the privilege of waste means I don't have to waste my time managing all the food scraps, managing all the clothing scraps, managing all the paper scraps, right? But the Great Depression, if we have a second one, is going to require us to be hyper intense with particularly our food, but really all of the stewardship of our resources. Learning to take the last few bites from someone's plate and save them. Learning to take every leftover and turn that into something else. Learning how to take leftover bits and pieces and make a new meal or put those things together to make something else, to feed someone else. These are going to be skills, right? So this is going to mean lots of different ways of preserving. So it's going to be things like home canning, right? Home canning meat, because you may have someone who, is able to shoot a deer, go hunting and shoot a deer, and they have more meat than they can handle, and they're going to share it with you if you are able to help them preserve some. So you should probably know how to can some venison, right? Or beef, which is similar enough if you're practicing. But that is something that you could do. Learn how to dehydrate. If you have that wonderful garden, learn how to dehydrate so you have a way to preserve things for winter. Or freeze dry. If you have a freeze dryer and you can afford it, and you're interested in adding that skill to your repertoire, learn and get really good at freeze drying and knowing, okay, I made a pot of chili. I have 2 cups left. That's really only 1 or 2 servings. I'm going to go ahead and freeze it or freeze dry it and then put how much is on there and know that's a meal, right? That is a meal that I can have. Learning how to really use everything. You may not do this every single day. Maybe you do a week at a time. You practice really hyper intensive food management. Maybe it's looking at, okay, what would I do if I couldn't buy any clothing for a year? 0%. No matter what happened, there was no budget for new shoes, new clothes when the jeans rip. What skills would I need? What tools would I need to mend what I have? Thinking about that, practicing that now, even if you have the money to invest in a new pair of, let's say, hiking boots. Maybe you have work boots, okay? Maybe you go and you buy a pair of work boots and you keep them in your closet, but you're going to figure out how to repair the ones you have now. So you've learned that skill. These are the things, the stewardship of the resources we have, that the people who survived the Great Depression did really, really well, that we don't necessarily do well now. So think about preservation, both in the kitchen, home canning, dehydrating, freeze drying, freezing, right? Pickling, all the ways you can preserve food, all the ways you can take leftovers and turn them into something else. Learn that skill, learn really good food stewardship, but also think about how that then applies to all the other resources you have. Energy stewardship, clothing stewardship, all the materials in your home stewardship. How would you steward them? If you were to cut your income in half, how would you survive on that? How would you make things work, right? If you could not buy a shred of clothing for a year, what would you do to make all the things you have last, right? So that's that stewardship, particularly in the kitchen, but really in all aspects of your life, will be a huge piece that we can learn from the Great Depression. Okay, my fourth recommendation is to consider community. Really, this is so important regardless of whether or not we're going into an economic downturn, if we're going into a recession or a Great Depression or a Dust Bowl or a war. I mean, there are so many terrifying unknowns out there. But community is really, really important. And however you decide to generate that community, whether it's your actual neighbors, whether it's a religious community that's giving you life, think about this community and make sure it's a community you can get to, even if like the cost of gasoline skyrockets, right? If your religious community is an hour away, that might not be the local community that you need to spend your energy on. But think about how you can build local, walkable, or bicycleable community where you are right now, and practice the things that you will need for when everything falls apart. I had community who helped support me during my most recent surgery. I had community that brought me meals. I had community that checked on me. I had community that was offering to help with chores around the house. Not because I asked, but because they were in community with me. Now, I happen to be a Christian, and this was my church community, and my church community is pretty close to me. So I'm very fortunate in that way. But I also had neighbors on either side of me who knew it was happening and were offering to help watch the kids and be very, supportive of our family. Folks in the Great Depression did something called potlucks, where people would bring kind of their odds and ends, and they would put everything together into like a big soup pot, kind of like stone soup, right? Where everybody adds bits, and together they can make a larger meal to feed more people. This potluck method can help save families. I mean, it can help save your neighborhood. Imagine if you had a bumper crop of carrots, but your potatoes totally failed. Well, now you can bring those carrots to a big stew, right? A big potluck party where you're all pitching in and everybody gets something. Maybe you have a ton of saved rice, but you did not store enough proteins. Instead of bartering with one family, you can bring and say, hey, listen, I can bring 4 cups of rice. We can make a whole bunch of rice to help feed this big potluck group. Practice those things now. Maybe not a potluck like that where everybody brings something, but maybe so. But maybe a regular potluck where everybody brings a dish. Practice that. Get to know people. Get to know what people's skills are. Get to know what people have interests in. Do you have a nurse on your street? Do you have a carpenter on your street? Do you have someone who knows how to work on cars or someone who knows how to work on electronics? What skills do you have? Because if you know that stuff now, you can begin to build these vibrant networks that when things are more expensive, when you can't just replace your computer or replace your car or replace your roof or replace your whatever, and you need someone who has a skill in repair, or you need someone who knows medical and there's no way to get to the ER, or the hospitals are flooded because we've closed all the rural hospitals because there's no Medicaid, right? And so all the city hospitals are overrun and there's no support. You just need to have someone do something minor. If you have a nurse who lives a couple doors down from you and a really good med kit, you might be able to avoid going to the doctor, right? But you won't know if you don't talk to people and you don't see who's in your network, who's in your community, who's in your neighborhood to build these relationships with. So do not underestimate the value of community, particularly things like eating together and the idea of that potluck, right? With money, we bring our own dish and share. But when you don't have money, you share your resources till you can feed your community. These are important, and these are things that families in the Great Depression did to survive. The fifth one really piggybacks right off of the fourth one, and that is invest in learning a skill. This is something that I want to do once we get into some space where I have a little bit more free time, but I want to learn some practical skill. Probably wilderness first aid will be my first stop, but learn something. Learn wilderness first aid, learn a handicraft, learn carpentry, learn electrical skill, learn masonry or basic mechanics. Learn something. Go learn something. Go learn something applicable. Now, maybe you already have that. Maybe you're an electrician and you're super great at your job. Awesome. Do you know how to handle like solar panels? Is that something you've learned? If you haven't, go get really good at that. Go learn that skill. If you are someone who's maybe a nurse, can you add to your repertoire something that's outside of what you do every single day, or brush up on things that you learned way back when you were in nursing school, right? If you're a teacher, awesome. Can you add a skill like campfire starting, right? Or foraging, identifying wild plants into your zeitgeist? Can you add some kind of practical skill in so that you don't have just what you do for your day job, you have this other skill as well? This is going to help. I think things like carpentry and basic mechanics and basic like electrician skills, I think those are actually way more useful in my personal opinion. I think being able to troubleshoot technology would be a really, really good one. Any kind of cybersecurity might be a really good skill to pick up if you're already pretty well versed in tech stuff. All of this is kind of building on, really that idea of being well-rounded. Learn a skill. Maybe you're super good at gardening. Maybe that's your skill. Maybe you're super good at preserving. Maybe that's your skill. But go learn something that can be useful when money is tight, resources are limited. What would be useful to you right now? If right now we were in the Great Depression, what would be a skill you'd want to have access to? And then go learn it. Go start practicing. All right, my sixth and final of the recommendations is to invest in low-tech or off-grid resources. And this is sort of a twofold. Now, initially, I was thinking about things like entertainment and morale boosters. So like board games that don't need the internet, things like books and like arts and crafts activities, or balls and bats, and just ways to keep you, your kids, your neighborhood with something fun to do if there's no internet or if there's no electricity, right? If things are junky, but you can watch the kids play a game of soccer or baseball, it will lift your spirits, it will lift their spirits, it will be a beautiful thing. If things are junky, but you have a nice stack of classics that you can read to your kids, it will help make up for the idea of not having streaming networks available, right? But the more I thought about this, the more I wanted to really expand it beyond just entertainment and morale boosters. Those are important. Don't overlook them. They are worth the investment. But I also wanted to say that where you can invest in having a redundancy for the grid, the better off you are. If you can afford to go solar, I wouldn't say go solar to the exclusion of using the grid. The grid has value, but if you can go solar with a setup where you can be on the grid and then switch and be off grid, that could be of value to you if you can afford to do so. If you can set up a rainwater harvesting system or a well, some kind of off-grid well system, a solar pump with backup propane battery or something like that, if you can create systems where you can use the grid if you want, but you don't have to use the grid, those would be worthwhile investments. Now, I'm not a proponent of everybody going off-grid. My husband would really struggle because he has a collapsing back. Like, we benefit from the grid. And the very fact that I am making this and I'm using an iPhone and I'm putting it on the internet and it's going on to YouTube means we need all the people who are on the grid between me and you to make this video happen, right? So I could be off grid and you could be off grid, but I guarantee you there's 20 people in between us to make this video happen, as far as putting the phone together, making sure the internet runs, making sure the YouTube website is up, that need to be on grid. Right? People who are disabled need the grid. People who are elderly often need the grid, right? So I'm not a proponent to say we should get rid of the grid, but the more redundancies that you can build in that make you less dependent on the grid means that when the cost of your utilities skyrocket, you don't have to depend on them, or not depend on them as much. When those utilities may have rolling blackouts or be shut down altogether for whatever reasons, you still have access to some basic utilities like water and lighting. But what happens if all that goes away? Well, the same preps that you would have for a disaster can be used in those same scenarios, right? That same Great Depression scenario. Have your lighting, have your water purification, have your systems in place, and know that they will serve you whether or not it's a tornado that rolls in or it's the Great Depression. I think the biggest takeaway for me, all of these points are really important, right? They are 6 keys that I think are useful. But one of the things that I really thought about was the ways in which one of the images we have of the Great Depression was the soup line, right? The soup kitchen line, all the people lined up waiting for their hot bowl of soup once a day. And that was a government program mostly. I mean, there were churches and things that did that, but a lot of them were government programs. And how we got out of the Great Depression with the New Deal, with government-sponsored jobs, right? All the government works programs. Where I lived in West Virginia were tons of government-sponsored programs that got people working in Appalachia. And do we have a government that would do that for us? Will we ever have a government that cares enough about the people to do something like that for us? I don't know. So how can we invest in non-governmental resources that can be there, that can have soup lines, soup kitchens? If you have a religious organization or a civics, a civil community-based organization that you trust and you believe in, maybe supporting them, being involved now and being involved with, supporting their missions and their programming could be a way to give us a non-governmental option that would be there in a crisis. But that is something I've really been trying to think about, is that the Great Depression didn't end because our economy just bounced back. That's not what happened. The Great Depression ended because Franklin Delano Roosevelt was voted in with the New Deal. And that New Deal was lots of government jobs to get people back to work, taxing the rich at something like 80% maybe 90%, in order to fund those jobs, putting people to work, getting us back on our feet, and then eventually the war. My big takeaways really are many of the same preps you are already doing for disasters, natural disasters, and man-made disasters are still going to be useful to you in a future economic crisis. And I do believe one is coming. I hate that. I hate to say that. I am not here to be a doom and gloomer, but at the very least, we're going to have a recession, if not something that's worse. Right now is the time to use as much buying power as you can without going into debt. Don't go into debt. But without going into debt, try to buy your staples. Try to invest in strategic freeze-dried or dehydrated goods that can last a long time so you can buy once and have it. You don't have to worry about it going bad on you. Look at ways you can create redundancies in your utilities. Look at ways you can create redundancies in your stewardship of resources, right? How can you practice that now when the stakes are low? How can you learn skills now when the stakes are low that will serve you when the stakes are high? Really take advantage of that, because we are very likely going to go into a major recession, if not a full depression, over the next 18 months. I don't know. I'm not an economist. And I do think that we can look at the Great Depression and help us understand the lessons that they learned and how we can prepare based on what they did well. Friends, comment down below. Let me know what you think of my 6 keys and what you would add. What did I miss? I'm sure there are plenty of things. I'm also curious, let me know what skill you would be learning, and especially if it's one I didn't mention. I'd love to get your insights on what you want to learn or are planning or are already in the process of learning that you think would be of benefit. I think there's a ton of skills. I think about like hunting, for example, hunting and then being able to butcher the animal that you have killed and harvest that meat is a skill that I didn't mention before, but I think would actually be a really solid one. So let me know what your thoughts are. And yeah, y'all, until the next video, happy prepping.